Stop the presses. We have drama on Twitter. Okay, it's not really that much drama in honesty, but I thought it was interesting enough that we could talk about it today. What drama am I talking about? Well, if we have a look at this GameSpot article, dev steps away from making games after alleged abuse of Steam's refund policy. Now, for those of you who don't know, Steam has a refund policy on all of its games, which says that you may refund a game, no questions asked, as long as you have played fewer than 2 hours of the game, and as long as you bought the game within the last couple of weeks. And this applies universally across all of their games. Developer Emika Games, who have developed a game called Summer of 58, have called out this policy on the basis that for small indie teams, a 2-hour runtime might not be the entire length of the game, in fact. And there's nothing wrong with that. If any of you have tuned in to my streams, you will have seen the latest game that I streamed was Gorogoa, which is a game that runs for around about 90 minutes. Now, according to the Steam refund policy, you can indeed get all the way to the end of a game, and if you have completed that game within the 2-hour period, you can submit that game for a refund. Is this reasonable? Is it an abuse of the refund policy? And does this mean that Valve needs to reevaluate whether that refund policy is fit for purpose? Let's jump into a couple of points. Now, here's the statement from Emika Games, and I want to headline this entire discussion by saying that it is always a shame when someone decides to move on from a particular industry. Full disclosure, I've not played any of Emika Games' games. This is a totally theoretical conversation about software refund policies. The horror genre is just something that doesn't really appeal to me. But a broad and diverse range of people and developers, particularly indie developers, is good for the games industry. This diversity amongst indie developers helps to ensure that we are getting a diversity of stories and a diversity of experiences being told through this electronic medium. So I want to get that part of the discussion out the way. It is absolutely 100% a shame that this person has decided to leave the games industry. Now let's talk about the Steam refund policy. Is it fit for purpose? I'd say there are 3 tests that you need to apply to a refund policy to determine whether it's going to be fit for purpose. The first test it has to pass is communicability. It needs to be easy to understand, and you need to know whether you're eligible for that refund policy currently. You have to bear in mind that for some users, the person buying the game or refunding the game might not be the same person as the player, parents of children, for example. So it needs to be very clear what the refund policy is, it needs to be easy to communicate, and the person playing the game needs to know when they are approaching that critical threshold when they are not going to be eligible for a refund anymore. In my opinion, the 2-hour time limit works very well for that communicability and understandability of when you are going to hit that point of no return, when you can't refund your software anymore. That's a little bit more difficult if you're doing something like a certain percentage of the game. A lot of people in response to this Twitter thread were saying that you could track it by achievements, or you could track it by a certain percentage of the game. After you get past 50% of the game, you're no longer eligible for a refund. Or after the end credits roll, you're not eligible for a refund. The difficulty with that is, it becomes very hard as a player to know when you're reaching that point where you're not going to be able to be eligible for a refund anymore. And so you lose that transparency. Whilst we're on the topic of certain percentage of the way through the game, let's talk about the second test that your refund policy has to pass. This is consistency. Video games are a broad medium. There's a lot of different kinds of games, a lot of different kinds of genre. Now combine that with the fact that Steam also sells software as well as games, and you need something that's going to be able to be applied consistently across a broad range of things. Now, the suggestion that the refund policy should be based upon a certain percentage of the game being completed might make sense for a very tight, linear story-driven, narrative-driven experience, but does it make sense for a purely creative experience? Some games, for example, are literally sandbox games. They don't have a narrative for you to be able to complete, so a certain percentage of the way through that game might not mean anything. Similarly, something like a roguelike. Would 50% of the game be 50% through your first run, or 50% through the whole game? If you're playing FTL, do you get to Sector 5 within 45 minutes and suddenly you've completed 50% of the game? If you were playing something like Through the Breach or Loop Hero, you could suddenly get very far in the game in a very small amount of time. Now, some people have suggested that there needs to be different rules for long games and short games, and I would say that that would fail the test for communicability, because games don't fit neatly into a binary of long or short. They fit onto a spectrum where there isn't really a clear cutoff between what would be considered a long game, what would be considered a short game, and so unless you were making it very clear at the point of purchase which of your two refund policies this game falls under, it wouldn't be very clear. Finally, the third test that your refund policy has to pass is whether it is reasonable. Look, this is about striking a balance between the interests of the developers and the publishers and the interests of the consumers. You could suggest that for a really long game, 2 hours might not be long enough to assess whether you like the game or not. I've certainly played some games, looking at you, Metal Gear Solid 5, where 2 hours doesn't get you out of the tutorial. Do you even know whether you're going to enjoy that game before your refund window is gone anyway? But it's a question of reasonableness. You do need to balance these competing priorities of the developers and publishers versus the consumers. And 2 hours seems, to me at least, to be a reasonable balance. Is it going to be perfect for every game? Obviously not. And yes, people abusing the refund policy to refund a game that they've completed is a little bit of a scummy thing to do. Should Valve reassess their refund policy in light of this? No. I'd like to end on one final thought, and that is one of why this refund policy was originally put into place. 10 years ago, or slightly more, the Steam store was littered with rubbish. Shovelware, asset flips, it was horrendous. Jim Sterling would do a video on it about every month. The point of the refund policy, the no-quibble 2-hour money-back guarantee, is to protect users from nefarious developers asset flipping, shovel-wearing, and just putting that stuff out there, and some people are going to buy it. The 2-hour no-quibble policy is user protection against these kind of practices that people literally used to do. And people would abuse this, again, if the policy were to change. If the policy were to change to a certain percentage of the game being completed, nefarious developers would literally make 30-minute games with an achievement that said, congratulations, you've passed 50% of the game 15 minutes in. Now, what I'm trying to get at by reminiscing about the Steam store from 10 years ago is that this Steam refund policy, although it might not look like it on the face of things, is good for both developers and users. It's good for developers because as a user, if you are empowered to be able to refund games within the first couple of hours, no questions asked, you are freer to take a punt or take a risk buying a game that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily buy. It means that you can buy a game on launch day, you can buy a game from a small indie developer, and if you play it for an hour and it's not for you, you can always refund it. And that means more indie devs get their games played than otherwise they would. And so, in summary, I think the Steam refund policy should stay exactly how it is. I think it strikes the perfect balance between communicability, transparency, reasonableness, and the ability for it to be able to be applied consistently across all of the games on the platform. And for that reason, I think that Valve should just keep the refund policy exactly how it is. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you very much for listening to me have a rant about the Steam refund policy and how it should stay exactly how it is. If you found this video interesting, please consider giving me a like and subscribe. Other than that, all that remains to be said is thank you very much for watching, and we'll chat again soon.